Nobody in the trauma ward at Mercy General had ever heard Nurse Reyes raise her voice above a controlled, clinical calm. Not during the 7-car pileup on the interstate. Not during the triple stabbing on New Year's Eve. Not even during the night the ER ceiling collapsed and everyone else was screaming into their radios. She was famous for it, that eerie, unshakable stillness. The kind that made terrified patients feel like maybe, just maybe, they weren't going to die on a Tuesday. So when the entire 4th floor heard a woman's voice tear through the walls like a combat knife, through canvas, raw, absolute, and radiating the specific energy of someone who had given orders under live fire, every head snapped up from every chart. 3 words. That's all it was. Get the FCK away from my patient. Asterisk. The hallway outside room 412 went dead silent. And then the man in the bed, the man with the chest full of shrapnel and the face of a soldier who had stopped fearing death somewhere around his 3rd deployment, turned his head toward the sound of that voice and went completely, utterly pale. Not from blood loss, not from pain, because the woman standing between him and the 4 heavily armed men who had just shouldered their way into the ICU wasn't supposed to be alive. She had been dead for 6 years. The graveyard shift at Mercy General Hospital in Baltimore had a particular smell. Antiseptic, and old coffee, and something indefinably human. The kind of scent that settled into your scrubs and followed you home and reminded you, at 7 a.m. when you finally crawled into bed, exactly what kind of work you had been doing all night. Dr. Marcus Webb had been breathing that smell for 11 years. As the senior trauma attending on the night shift, he was a man who prided himself on having seen everything the city could possibly throw a hospital. Gunshots, industrial accidents. A man who had survived being hit by 2 separate buses on 2 separate occasions. Marcus no longer flinched. He was, as his wife once told him, professionally unsurprisable. He had never met anyone who embodied that quality more completely than Nurse Reyes. She had appeared on his floor 14 months ago. She came through the staffing agency, one of the high-clearance specialty contractors that administration brought in when the ICU was critically understaffed and nobody wanted to talk about why. Her paperwork was pristine. Her credentials were impeccable. Her references checked out through 3 different verification layers. She was 34, according to her file. Lean and compact, with dark hair she kept pinned back in a tight, utilitarian braid, and eyes the color of polished walnut that seemed to assess every room she entered the way a chess player assesses a board. Not panicking, just calculating. She was exceptionally good at her job. Textbook efficient in a crisis. Better than textbook, actually. She was the kind of efficient that made other nurses feel like they were moving through water. But it was the other things that made Marcus uneasy. She never parked in a hospital lot. She always walked in from a different direction and never the same direction twice. She never placed food delivery orders to the hospital. She never complained about being tired, which was impossible because no human being who worked the graveyard shift at a level 1 trauma center was never tired. She always sat with her back to the wall in the break room. She always knew where the exits were before she needed them. And she had a way of scanning a room when she entered it, a slow, thorough, counterclockwise sweep of the space that had absolutely nothing to do with nursing. Marcus had brought it up exactly once, casually, over stale vending machine sandwiches in the break room. You ever do anything before nursing, Reyes? You kind of move like. He had searched for the word. Like what? She asked, unwrapping her sandwich with the precise economy of someone who had learned to eat fast and often didn't get to finish. Like someone who checks rooms for things that shouldn't be in them. She had looked at him for a moment with those calm, walnut eyes. Then she smiled, a quiet, unremarkable smile that revealed exactly nothing. I was a competitive swimmer in college, she said. You develop habits. She took a bite of her sandwich. The conversation was over. Marcus didn't push it. Good nurses were too hard to find and too easy to lose, and whatever Reyes' habits were, they were keeping patients alive on his floor. That was the only metric that mattered at 3 a.m. The night it all unraveled began the way catastrophic nights at Mercy General always did. Quietly. It was the 2nd week of January. A cold front had locked Baltimore under a sheet of iron-gray cloud, and the ER below was running at capacity with frostbite cases, a house fire, and a particularly bad batch of something the paramedics were calling synthetic trash that had put 4 young men into simultaneous cardiac events. The ICU on the 4th floor was quieter. 7 beds, 6 occupied. Room 412 had been prepped and waiting for a new admission all evening, and at 11:47 p.m., it got one. The elevator doors opened, and the world changed. 4 men came off the elevator first. They weren't in tactical gear, which was more alarming than if they had been. Tactical gear you could identify. These men wore civilian clothes, dark jackets, and khakis, but they moved in a specific close-quarters formation, and the jackets were cut to conceal the outlines of weapons, and their eyes were scanning the corridor the same way Nurse Reyes always scanned rooms. Marcus noticed all of this in the 3 seconds before the gurney came through the elevator doors. The man on the gurney was enormous. Easily 240 pounds of dense, combat-hardened muscle wrapped in civilian clothes that had been cut away by paramedics. He was breathing, but barely. His chest was packed with field dressings that were soaked completely through. He was pale in the specific way that meant massive blood loss. His jaw was clenched, so hard Marcus could see the tendons in his neck from across the room. The 5th man came off the elevator last. He was tall, late 40s, silver hair cropped close. The kind of face that had been handsome once and was now something more than that, weathered and hard and entirely without softness. He was wearing a black tactical vest over a dark flannel shirt, and he walked with the particular authority of a man who had never in his adult life had to announce who he was in a room. He flashed a badge at Marcus before Marcus could speak. "Dr. Webb," he said. Marcus had not told him his name. "I'm Commander Holt, JSOC. Your trauma team will treat this patient. You will ask no questions about his identity, his injuries, or who we are. Your hospital administrator has already been briefed. All ICU staff on this floor will be replaced by our team the moment your patient is stable." Marcus stared at him. "Replaced," Marcus said. "This is a federal patient under active operational security. Your staff will be escorted to the break room and held there until we authorize clearance. Standard protocol." "Standard protocol for what? Exactly?" Commander Holt looked at him the way a man looks at a speed bump. "For keeping your staff alive, doctor. Move." They moved. Nurse Reyes was already in room 412 when they wheeled the patient in. She had been performing a routine check on the 4 lines left over from the previous occupant, and she had simply stayed when she heard the commotion in the hall. 2 of the security men had swept the room before the gurney arrived. They had looked at her, looked at each other, and said nothing. She had said nothing either. She watched them transfer the massive patient from the gurney to the hospital bed with the focused calm of someone observing and calculating simultaneously. Her eyes moved over the field dressings, over the specific pattern of shrapnel wounds on the left side of the chest, over the way the patient's left hand was curled against his side in the involuntary protective gesture of someone with cracked ribs. She noted the specific type of field dressing being used. She noted the brand of 4-line the paramedics had started. She noted the particular chemical smell that clung to the patient's clothes beneath the blood. Her expression did not change. Commander Holt stepped into the room and looked at her. "Who are you?" "Nurse Reyes. I'm the ICU nurse assigned to this room. You're being relieved. One of our medics will take over patient management." Maya looked at the man in the bed, and then she looked at the dressings on his chest, and then she looked at Commander Holt. "His left hemothorax is expanding," she said. "If your medic isn't in the room in 90 seconds, your patient is going to herniate his trachea, and nobody is saving him after that. Where is your medic?" Holt's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He tapped his earpiece. "Brooks, get to room 412 now." He looked back at Maya. "You stay until Brooks arrives. You do not touch the patient. You do not speak to the patient. You keep your hand where I can see them, and you answer every question my team asks you. Is that understood?" Maya said nothing. She was already at the bedside, her fingers finding the patient's wrist, her eyes on the monitor she had silently powered on the moment she heard them coming down the hall. She was taking a pulse, not because she needed to with the monitor running, but because she was doing something else simultaneously. Looking at the patient's hand, at the specific calluses on his trigger finger and the web of his thumb, at the faded scar tissue running diagonally across his forearm in the particular pattern left by a fast rope without gloves, at the small tattoo on the inside of his wrist. It was tiny, barely half an inch of faded blue ink. Most people would have thought it was a meaningless doodle, a vestigial mark from someone's youth. Maya Reyes was not most people. She recognized it immediately. It was a trident, not the standard seal trident worn as a badge. Something smaller, deliberate, personal. Inside the trident's center tine, rendered in letters so small they were almost invisible, were 3 characters. K, 4-7. Maya's hand went very still on the patient's wrist. Her eyes did not move to Holt. They moved instead to the patient's face. The patient, who had been semi-conscious since they wheeled him in, seemed to feel the change in the room. His eyelids dragged open. His eyes were brown, dark and blown with pain and the particular fog of blood loss. But they focused. They found her face, and something happened in them. Not recognition. Something before recognition. Something more fundamental. The way a person reacts to hearing their native language in a foreign country before their conscious mind even processes the words. His lips moved. Marcus Webb, standing in the doorway behind Commander Holt, couldn't hear what the man said. But he saw Maya Reyes's face in the moment the words were spoken, and he would never be able to fully describe what he saw there. It was not surprise. It was not shock. It was the specific expression of someone whose carefully constructed world has just been surgically detonated at the foundation. Then the door opened behind Holt, and a man named Brooks came through it. Brooks was young, 26, maybe 27. He was built like a truck and carried a military medical kit the size of a small suitcase. And he moved with the competent confidence of someone who had treated wounds in places where calling for backup was not an option. He took one look at the patient and one look at Maya, standing beside the bed, and he said, with a politeness that was really a dismissal, "Ma'am, I've got it from here." "Thank you." He stepped between Maya and the patient. And that was when something in Maya Reyes simply switched. It happened without warm-up, without escalation. One moment, she was a composed ICU nurse performing a patient assessment. The next moment, she was something else entirely. "Get the F***CK away from my patient." The words came out with a flat, absolute authority that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with command. It wasn't the raised voice of a frightened person. It was the voice of someone who had given orders in conditions where getting them wrong meant people died. Brooks stopped moving, not because he was intimidated, because that voice, that specific cadence and register of absolute operational authority, reached past his training and grabbed something animal and instinctive by the back of the neck. In the bed, the patient turned his head. Commander Holt took a step forward, his hand moving toward the weapon under his jacket. "Ma'am, step back from it." "His left chest tube is kinked," Maya said, and she wasn't talking to Holt. She was talking to Brooks, her eyes locked on the senior medic. "If you pull that dressing without releasing the kink first, you're going to introduce a tension pneumothorax. You don't have the equipment in that kit to reverse it." "I do. So step back and let me work, or he is dead in 4 minutes, and you explain that to whoever sent him here." Brooks looked at Holt. Holt looked at Maya. The monitor beside the bed let out a long, climbing alarm tone. The patient's blood pressure was dropping through the floor. Holt made a decision. Let her work. Maya moved. She had gloves on before anyone saw her reach for them. She was at the supply cabinet, selecting instruments with the speed and certainty of someone who had prepared this exact scenario in her mind the moment the patient came through the door. Her hands were moving with the fluid, mechanical precision that Dr. Marcus Webb had long since stopped trying to explain away. She worked in near silence for 4 minutes. Brooks assisted her without being told, the two of them falling into the wordless efficiency of experienced medical operators. And Marcus Webb stood in the doorway and watched a woman release a kinked chest tube with her bare hands in a sealed pleural space and not lose a drop of blood doing it. The monitor settled. The numbers climbed. Not fast, but steady. He's stabilizing, Brooks said quietly. Maya stripped off her gloves. She stepped back from the bed, and the patient, who had lain completely still through all of it, who had not made a sound even when the procedure should have made him scream, opened his eyes fully for the first time. He looked at her face for a long, measured moment. The room was quiet. Holt's hand was still near his weapon. Brooks was watching the monitors. Dr. Webb was frozen in the doorway. The patient spoke. His voice was damaged from blood and dehydration, barely above a rasp, but the words came out with perfect clarity. "Phantom," he said. "You're Phantom." The room went off a cliff. Commander Holt didn't draw his weapon. He didn't need to. The word hit harder than a weapon. It hit like a recognition code, like someone speaking the name of a ghost to its face. He turned to look at the patient, then at Maya, then back at the patient. The color moved out of his face by degrees. "Morrow," he said carefully, using the patient's name for the first time. "You're in shock. You're losing blood. Don't. That's Phantom." The patient, Sergeant First Class Daniel Morrow, said again, louder now, his brown eyes fixed entirely on Maya Reyes. There was no fog in them anymore. The pain was still there, massive and obvious, but underneath it, something had arrived that was harder than pain. Something that looked like grief and fury and relief all pressed together into an expression no hospital had ever prepared Marcus Webb to understand. "Phantom is dead, Sergeant," Holt said. His voice was flat and controlled and entirely wrong. "She died 6 years ago in Kandahar. You know that. Then somebody ought to tell her," Morrow rasped. Nobody moved. Maya Reyes stood beside the bed in her dark blue ICU scrubs, her braids slightly loosened from the procedure, her hands relaxed at her sides. She was not running. She was not explaining. She was simply standing very still in the way that people stand when they have been found after a very long time and are not yet certain whether being found is safe. "What is your name?" Holt said. He was not asking Maya Reyes, the ICU nurse. He was asking something else entirely, something he wasn't fully willing to name yet. "My name is Maya Reyes," she said. "I have worked at this hospital for 14 months. My personnel file is on record with the staffing agency. My nursing license was issued by the state of Maryland. Everything checks out. That's not what I asked." The monitor beeped. The 4-line dripped. The Baltimore wind threw sleet against the dark window of room 412. "My name," Maya said, and her voice had changed, very slightly, in a way that was nearly impossible to define. The clinical flatness was still there, but underneath it, something had moved like tectonic plates, shifting somewhere deep. 6 years ago, in a different life, was Captain Elena Vasquez. Call sign Phantom. JSOC Special Operations Combat Medic, attached to Task Force Nightfall. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight and temperature. Brooks sat down slowly on the corner of the supply cart. Holt's hand finally dropped away from his jacket. In the doorway, Dr. Marcus Webb felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up in a long, slow wave. "You're dead," Holt said. The word sounded strange coming out of his mouth. Not a statement, an argument, like he was pushing back against something fundamentally wrong with the universe. "I know what the report says," Elena, Maya, said quietly. "We buried you. I know that too." "Then tell me," Holt said, and for the first time, the command drained completely out of his voice, leaving behind something human and raw. "Tell me why." She told them. Not the version that would appear in any official report. The version that only exists in the silence between two people who were there when everything went wrong. Task Force Nightfall had been operating in the Arghandab River Valley for 3 months when the intelligence started smelling wrong. Small things at first. Extraction windows that opened a few minutes late. Unexpected patrols in sectors that had been clear 24 hours prior. A source who burned 3 weeks before he should have been exposed. Elena had started keeping her own record. Nothing formal. A small notebook she carried in her left breast pocket, the one against her chest, the one she reached for when she thought nobody was watching. She was a combat medic, not an intelligence analyst, but she had grown up in a family of chess players, and she could see the shape of a long game when she was living inside it. By the time Firebase Kilo was overrun, she had 14 entries in that notebook. Names, dates, Coordinate discrepancies that shouldn't exist. A pattern that pointed towards something terrible and specific. She had been working on her third casualty of the night when the RPG took out the command tent. The blast had thrown her 40 feet. She had landed in a dry irrigation ditch and lain there in the ringing, suffocating darkness for long enough to understand that the firebase was falling, that extraction was compromised, and that the men who had ordered the extraction also appeared. According to 14 entries in a chest pocket notebook, to have coordinated the ambush. She had two choices: surface and survive. Return to command. Hand over her notebook to people who might be working for the same hands that had just tried to kill everyone she served with. Spend whatever remained of her career watching those 14 entries disappear into the machinery of institutional denial. Or die. Go dark. Become a casualty of a chaotic nighttime firefight in which positive identification of remains was, realistically, impossible. Slip away. Spend the next 6 years being nobody while the notebook's contents were confirmed, case by case, name by name. And were they? Holt asked. His voice was very quiet. Confirmed. For convictions in the past 3 years, Maya said. Pentagon procurement fraud. Illegal weapons contracts. Coordinated intelligence leaks resulting in operator deaths. All 4 men were on my list. The room absorbed that. You've been running a parallel investigation, Holt said. I've been keeping a promise, Maya said. To the 12 men who died at Kilo because someone sold their coordinates for a defense contract kickback. In the bed, Daniel Morrow had not taken his eyes off her face since she started speaking. He was the only person in the room who was not surprised. Not because he had known she was alive. He hadn't. He had stood in the rain at her memorial. He had laid her commendation on the folded flag. He wasn't surprised because, somewhere underneath 6 years of grief, he had apparently never fully believed it. The last name on the list, Maya said, and her voice changed again, tightening just slightly, is the reason you're in this bed tonight, Sergeant Morrow. Holt went completely still. What do you mean? The man who greenlit the Kilo ambush wasn't one of the 4 convicted. He was too senior, too careful, too protected. He retired honorably 2 years ago with a Distinguished Service Medal and a consulting contract worth 8 figures. She paused. You were getting close. Your unit's last operation, the intelligence breach that got you hit. I've seen the pattern before. He's cleaning house. You were next on his list. Holt turned to look at Morrow. Morrow looked back at him. She's right, Morrow said. We knew something was off about the op. I just couldn't prove it. I can prove it, Maya said. She reached into the pocket of her scrubs, not the breast pocket, the lower left, which she had chosen specifically because nobody checks the lower left of a nurse's scrubs, and placed a small encrypted drive on the bedside table. For years of work, case files, financial records, communication intercepts obtained through channels she would never be able to fully explain in any official proceeding. 14 names. 1 still living. 1 still powerful. 1 still dangerous. Holt stared at the drive. The monitor beeped steadily. Morrow's blood pressure had climbed to 90/60. Not good, but no longer critical. Brooks had one hand on the 4 line and his eyes on the screen and the quiet, careful expression of a man who is pretending not to process the conversation happening 4 feet away from him. If I hand this over, Holt said slowly, you surface. You stop being Maya Reyes. You become Elena Vasquez again. AWOL for 6 years. Unauthorized intelligence activity. Operating under a false identity. I know. The legal exposure is significant. I know that too. You could have done this differently, Holt said. And there was something in his voice that might have been anger and might have been the kind of anguish that looks like anger when it doesn't want to be seen. You could have come to me 6 years ago. You could have trusted. I did the math, Maya said simply. At the time I ran, 2 of the 4 convictions were active duty. One of them outshrank you. I didn't know who was clean. The silence stretched. Do you know now? Holt asked. Maya looked at him for a moment with those steady walnut eyes. You're here, she said. You're bleeding with him. That told me. Dr. Marcus Webb did not know what to do with any of this. He was a trauma attending. He understood shock and hemorrhage and the specific geography of a dying body. He did not have a framework for standing in the doorway of his own ICU, listening to a woman he had worked alongside for 14 months reveal that she was a combat-dead special operations medic who had been quietly dismantling a Pentagon corruption ring from behind the cover of a nursing license. He stepped into the room. Everyone looked at him. His hematocrit is going to drop again in about 40 minutes, Marcus said, because it was true and because it was the only thing he was qualified to say. He needs the ore. His spleen is lacerated. I don't know what you're planning next, but medically speaking, your window is closing. Holt looked at him. Can you take him to surgery? That's literally my job, Commander. Something passed across Holt's face. Something that was almost a smile and was mostly relief. Brooks, Holt said, go with the doctor. Stay with Morrow through the ore. He turned to Maya. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The weight of 6 years and 14 names and one encrypted drive sitting on a hospital bedside table pressed down on the fluorescent-lit room. Elena, Holt said. It was the first time anyone in that building had called her by that name. It landed like a stone dropped into still water. Not yet, she said softly. Let me get him to the earth first. Holt nodded. One single slow nod, the kind that means more than agreement. Maya picked up the four-stand. She disconnected the brake on Morrow's bed with her foot. She nodded at Marcus. They moved. The surgery took 4 hours. Marcus repaired the lacerated spleen. Brooks stood at the head of the table and ran the anesthesia with a precision that made the anesthesiologist look at him sideways. Maya scrubbed in and assisted, and Marcus stopped noticing anything unusual about how she worked because he had watched her work for 14 months, and he had always known, on some level he hadn't let himself examine, that her hands had been trained for something beyond a nursing program. At 4:37 in the morning, Daniel Morrow came off the table alive. At 4:45, Commander Holt made a phone call from the 4th floor break room. Marcus Webb was not supposed to hear it. He heard it anyway. I need to speak to the Inspector General's office, Holt said. This is priority actual. I have a source, and I have documented evidence relating to a series of coordinated intelligence leaks resulting in 12 operator deaths. Tell them phantoms surfaced. Marcus sat down in a plastic chair in the hallway. The hospital hummed around him. Monitors beeped. Elevators opened and closed. Somewhere on the 3rd floor, somebody was being born. At 5:15, Maya Reyes came out of the post-surgical suite and walked down the hallway toward him. She had a cup of coffee in each hand. She sat down in the plastic chair beside his and handed him one. They sat in silence for a while. When they come, Marcus finally said, "What happens to you?" "I don't know exactly," she said. "But you're going." "Yes." Marcus looked down at his coffee. It was terrible, the way hospital coffee is always terrible, the way the graveyard shift at every hospital smells like antiseptic and old coffee and something indefinably human. "For what it's worth," he said, "you saved his life tonight. Twice, probably. The chest tube, and whatever it was you were doing for 14 months that got the people responsible for putting him in that bed." Maya wrapped both hands around her cup. "His name was Corporal Reyes," she said quietly. "The real Maya Reyes. He was 23. He was the first casualty at Kilo." She paused. "I borrowed his name. I figured he'd understand." Marcus didn't say anything. There was nothing adequate to say. "He used to joke," she continued, "that he wanted to go back to school and become a nurse after the army. He had this whole plan. He'd written it out in a letter to his sister." She took a slow breath. "I figure I could do that much for him. Actually become one." The hallway was quiet for a long moment. "You're a good nurse, Elena," Marcus said, and he used the name deliberately, and something in her shoulders shifted very slightly, the way a person shifts when they've been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and someone has finally offered to help hold it. "Thank you, Marcus," she said. Down the hall, the elevator opened. 2 men in dark suits stepped out and looked around, and then found Commander Holt, and the 3 of them moved in the direction of the post-surgical suite, and the shape of what came next was visible on the horizon. Maya Reyes, who had been Captain Elena Vasquez, who had been Phantom, set down her coffee cup, straightened her braid, and stood up. She looked down the hallway at the approaching men. She looked at Marcus. "When Morrow wakes up," she said, "tell him the last name on the list is in the file." Tell him Kilo is finished. She walked toward the elevator bank, toward the approaching suits, toward whatever morning held for her. Not running, not hiding, just walking with the particular straightness of someone who has been tilting against the world for 6 years and has finally put both feet flat on the floor. Marcus Webb sat in his plastic chair and watched her go. Later, when the official report was filed and the name Elena Vasquez appeared in connection with a high-profile Pentagon prosecution, the hospital would issue a statement about Maya Reyes' sighting, unforeseen circumstances, and a staffing transition. Her locker was emptied. Her name was removed from the scheduling board. But in the break room, the chair she always sat in, the one against the wall with the clear sight line to the door, stayed empty. Not because nobody wanted it, because nobody could bring themselves to sit in it. Some presences leave an impression that outlasts the person. And in room 412 of the ICU at Mercy General Hospital, a fully recovered Sergeant First Class Daniel Morrow told anyone who would listen that the most dangerous person he had ever encountered in 20 years of service had been a quiet nurse in dark blue scrubs who could feel a kinked chest tube with her hands in the dark and had been keeping a personal count of his enemies since before he knew he had them. He called her Phantom. He always would. Every ward has its ghosts. Not all of them are gone. Some of them are just waiting until the work is finished. If this story hit different, hit that like button, share it with someone who believes the quietest person in the room is often the most dangerous one, and subscribe for more stories about the extraordinary lives hiding in plain sight. You never know who's sitting at the next desk.